Pleasure to be here again. I gave a keynote in 2002 and 2004, and earlier in 2002 started working with John on the ASAG, Army Science Advisory Group. And my comments will follow up on General Van Riper's comments and Dr. Killian's presentation, and I'll try to provide a broader perspective on where we're going, because the types of changes that we're seeing and that are reflected at this conference is not a one-time paradigm shift. It's an ongoing transformation that's going to pick up speed. And it's interesting, I was chatting with John earlier, when we started on the Army Science Advisory Group in early 2002, and when I spoke at this conference in 2002, in fact I was looking at the conference program back from 2002, I spoke about how in the future we'll be taking the soldier out of combat situations and putting them in virtual reality environments. We'll be making increasing use of robotics. We will be incorporating nanotechnology in tiny robotic systems. We will be relying more and more on robust self-organizing communication systems. And all of that was really on the fringe of future capability. It was kind of a gleam in our eye back 4 years ago. And there were many of us, including Dr. Killian, who were talking about these things, but that was really not the mainstream. And today, if you look at the conference catalog, there's really been a sea change in orientation and perspective, because that's very much the science and technology that we're creating now. And the process of going from these kind of conceptions to the reality in the battlefield is going to be greatly reduced. In fact, according to my models, we're doubling the paradigm shift rate every decade. So there's a continual acceleration. Dr. Killian mentioned Crick and Watson, and I was at a conference recently on the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the structure of DNA, and all of us speakers, including Dr. Watson, were asked, okay, what will the next 50 years bring? And every speaker there, except for one other gentleman, Bill Joy and myself, used the last 50 years as a model for the next 50 years, which is not correct, because we're doubling the paradigm shift rate, roughly the rate of technical progress every decade. So we'll see 32 times more progress in the next 50 years as we saw in the last 50 years. So Dr. Watson himself said, in 50 years we'll have drugs that enable you to eat as much as you want and remain slim. And I said, Jim, we've already done that in animals by blocking the fat insulin receptor gene. That gene basically says, hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. And that was a good idea 1,000 years ago, but that now underlies an epidemic of obesity. So when that gene was blocked in animals, these animals ate ravenously and they remained slim. And it wasn't a fake slimness. They got the health benefits of being slim. They didn't get diabetes. They didn't get heart disease. They lived 20% longer. They got the health benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite. And there are 5 pharmaceutical companies rushing to bring fat insulin receptor gene inhibitors to the human market. And we'll see that in 5 to 10 years, not 50 years. And all of the predictions in general were overly conservative because of this failure to take the inherent exponential nature of progress into account. The actual impact on information technology is even more daunting. Dr. Killian showed one of my graphs, which actually will come up in a few minutes in my presentation, on the exponential pace of computer technology, and that slight curve was on a log graph. So we've seen a smooth exponential, doubly exponential growth in the price performance of computing for over 100 years. And right now we're doubling the price performance of computing every year. Doubling every year, it's multiplying by 1,000 in 10 years, 1 billion in 30 years, and because of the slow second level of exponential growth, we're actually increasing the rate of exponential growth exponentially. It took us 3 years to double the price performance of computing in 1900, 2 years in 1950, 1 year in the year 2000, it's already down to 11 months. It'll actually be 25 years. We will multiply the power of information technology, price performance, capacity, bandwidth, by 1 billion. While at the same time, we shrink technology, according to my models, at a rate of 100 per 3D volume per decade. So that's a 100,000-fold decrease in the size of key features in the next 25 years. And if you look at the impact that these technologies have today on our everyday lives and certainly on our warfighting capability, and imagine multiplying that by 1 billion and shrinking the size of key features by 100,000 in 3D volume over the next quarter century, you get some idea of what will be feasible. And Dr. Killian talked about predicting the future, and it's true that there's certain things about the future we can't predict, but there are some aspects of the future that we can predict reliably. And I've been studying this for 25 years, and I'll make this point repeatedly. Specific projects are very hard to predict. It's well known, it's very hard to predict the outcome of a specific battle. It's hard to predict the outcome of one business plan or a company. Will Google stock be higher or lower than it is today 3 years from now? What will the next wireless standard be? G3, WiMAX, CDMA? These things are hard to predict. But if you ask me what will the cost of a MIPS of computing be in 2010, or how much it will cost to sequence a base pair of DNA in 2012, or the spatial resolution and 3D volume of brain scanning in 2014, I can give you a figure, and it's likely to be correct. And I say this now not just overfitting to past data. I've been making these forward-looking predictions for a long time. And I got into this really because I realized that success as an inventor was really dependent on timing. And most inventors fail, not because they can't get the thing to work, but because the timing is wrong. Not all the enabling factors are in place when they need to be. And realizing this about 30 years ago, I started to develop mathematical models of technology evolution. And being an engineer, I gathered a lot of data and built mathematical models. I saw these models were tracking quite well, and I now have a team of 10 people that gathers data in many different areas, and we build models in many different fields, and they turn out to be quite predictable. And you might wonder, well, how can this be? I mean, if we can't predict the outcome of one battle, one company, one technical standard, how can we predict the overall impact of technology? Well, we see other examples in science of predictable results coming from unpredictable elements. And the classical example actually comes from the 19th century. Thermodynamics models a gas as a large collection of unpredictable, chaotically interacting particles. In fact, the movement of each molecule is modeled by a random walk. So you can't predict where that molecule will be 10 seconds from now. But the overall properties of the gas, made up of a large number of these dynamic, chaotically interacting random particles, is very predictable, according to the laws of thermodynamics, to a very high degree of precision. And so if you have a large dynamic system, certain aspects of that system will be predictable in the future. And technology evolution is just such a dynamic, chaotic system, where each project's unpredictable, the overall impact is remarkably predictable. And I'll show you a few dozen examples. We have hundreds of examples of this that we've come up with in our research. And the progress is remarkably predictable in many different areas. It's not just computer devices. It's not just Moore's Law. Moore's Law is really just one example of many within computation. And computation is just one example of this inherent exponential growth of information technology. It affects the internet. It affects biological technologies. The Genome Project itself was controversial in 1990 when it was introduced, because in 1989, skeptics pointed out that we had our best PhD students, our most advanced equipment. Around the world, we collected 1/10,000th of the genome. So it'll speed up some, but there's no way you're going to do this whole project in 15 years. And halfway through the project, the skeptics are still going strong, saying, I told you this wasn't going to work. I mean, here you are 7.5 years into a 15-year project, and you finish 1% of the project. But if you double 1% 7 times, which is exactly what happened over the next 7 years, you get 100%. And the project was completed about a year early. And that has continued past the completion of the genome in 2003, and we've now sequenced all the polymorphisms among humans, many different disease states, other species, and so on. Other aspects of biology are ramping up exponentially. The Proteome project, the Connectome project. I gave a presentation a few weeks ago to the directors of the National Institutes of Health and their chief scientists at an off-site meeting, and they shared with me this project they have to collect 1 million genomes. Well, that wasn't feasible when the genome cost $1 billion to collect. The first genome was $1 billion. We're now a couple of years away from a $1,000 genome. It cost $10 per base pair in 1990. It's under a penny today. In the mid-1980s, I saw the internet. It was on the ARPANET. It was a military project tying together a few thousand scientists. It was not on the public's radar map. I saw it doubling every year. For a variety of reasons, I felt that would continue. Doubling every year is multiplying by 1,000 in 10 years. So whereas it was going from 10,000 to 20,000 to 40,000 in the 80s, I felt there would be 20 million to 40 million to 80 million to 160 million nodes in the mid-1990s. And I predicted a World Wide Web tying together tens, ultimately hundreds of millions and billions of people emerging in the 1990s. And that seemed like a ridiculous prediction. It was heavily criticized in the 80s. And it happened really right on schedule. The first reference to the World Wide Web in the New York Times was 1993. I saw the chess supercomputers doubling in power every year. So that added 40 points to the chess score, because that's a log scale. And that put the crossover point to take the World Chess Championship in 1998. And I made that prediction in 85, and that seemed ridiculous then, when most casual chess players could defeat the best chess machines. And Kasparov was asked about this prediction in 1993, and he said, that's ridiculous. I've played the best chess computers in the world, and they're pathetic. They're brittle, they're predictable. And that was true in 93, but then in 97, it soared past him. And that's the nature of exponential growth. It's seductive. It looks like nothing is happening when you're doubling these small numbers. When it picks up traction, it can have truly transformational effects. And it's true of biology. It's true of this worldwide communication network, which is having profound impact on every aspect of our lives. I think ultimately it's really a very democratizing technology. I wrote in the mid-1980s that the Soviet Union was doomed because of the then emerging decentralized electronic communication. And they would either give their knowledge workers these powerful tools, much more powerful than the copiers they were banning, which would destroy totalitarian control, or they would deprive them of those tools and thereby destroy their economy. And I felt actually they would do a little bit of both. And in that coup against Gorbachev in 91, it wasn't Yeltsin standing on a tank that overturned that coup, although that was the photo op. It was this clandestine network of decentralized electronic communication, fax machines, early forms of email using teletype machines. The paradigm of grabbing the centralized TV and radio station and keeping everybody in the dark, which was key to totalitarian control, was broken. And I believe that underlies the wave of democracies that we've seen in the 1990s. And it's also democratized other sectors of society. And it has obviously, this kind of communication technology has positive and negative effects. General Van Riper was talking about casualties, and I chatted with him after his presentation. And we do have an encouraging trend. The casualties have actually come down dramatically. For many millions of people, many millions of casualties in the Civil War, and if you look at it on a log scale, it comes down smoothly to hundreds of thousands in the Korean War, and then tens of thousands in the Vietnam engagement, and low thousands in the two Iraqi wars. But we have this converse communication phenomena, and it's not really to blame the media. This is just the nature of the technology. We now have a front row seat on everything that happens. If there's a couple of casualties in an engagement, we hear about it within minutes. Whereas in World War II, there could be tens of thousands of casualties in a battle in the Pacific or in Europe, and if people heard about it at all, it was on a grainy newsreel in the movie theaters a few weeks later. So we need to plan for these accelerating changes, this exponential explosion of information technology, which is really affecting every aspect of our lives, and build that into our predictions. So it's not a one-time transformation in terms of the future combat systems. We need to be continually changing towards smaller, more widely distributed, self-organizing systems, greater use of robotics, greater use of virtual reality. Even if it's soldiers inside a weapon, and actually an Abrams tank is a pretty safe place to be, as it turns out, but the soldier's not going to look outside the window to see what's going on. That soldier still needs to be in some kind of virtual reality environment to have the right visualization tools to be able to see at appropriate scale the right details about that engagement. So let me, in the spirit of hauling coals to Newcastle, I did bring some of my own technology, but it does make an important point about these trends that I've been talking about. I've been involved, as John mentioned, with reading machines for the blind for over 30 years, and we created the first reading machine for the blind in 1976, which is a device about this size, the size of a large washing machine. It was quite expensive and limited in capability, but it could actually read books to the blind. And they got smaller over the years, and when I talk to disability technology conferences, I would generally say, well, someday a blind person will be able to take a device out of their pocket and just read printed material as they go through the day. Because there's a lot of, prior to our introduction of this pocket-sized reading machine for the blind, the Kurzweil reading machine was a small but still device on your desk, so you had to bring reading material back to your desk. Well, there's a lot of material that you read as you go through the day, sign on a wall, the bank ATM display, that you can't bring back to your desk. Well, you could bring a menu back to your desk, but you really want to read it in the restaurant. So I said someday a blind person will be able to take this out of their pocket and just read printed material as they go through the day, which will be another step in equal accessibility to this kind of information. So 4 years ago, the head of the National Federation of the Blind, with whom I'd worked with actually on the first reading machine, so already you've been talking about this concept for many years. When do you think this will be feasible? And so, well, according to our models of pocket digital cameras and pocket computers, the requisite camera and pocket computer technology to support this application will be available in 4 years. This was a conversation in 2002. So in 2006, we'll have the requisite hardware, second quarter to be exact. And so Dr. Maurer said, okay, well, how long will it take to develop the software? And I said, well, we have to develop this new layer of software. We have to go beyond just putting optical character recognition and text-to-speech synthesis in the pocket computer, because as the blind person's holding the device, there's 3 different degrees of freedom of rotation and tilt. There's uneven illumination. There's curved pages. There's poor quality optics. And I described 6 or 7 vagaries of real-world images taken by a handheld device. He said, okay, well, how long will that take? I said, 4 years. So he said, well, let's get started. So we got started in 2002, and the requisite digital camera and pocket computer technology came out right on time this spring to support this application. A little bit to my surprise, we actually got the software project done on time. And we introduced this in July, and there's now about 1,000 blind guys and gals going around reading everything from the labels in their clothing to remainders in the bookstore, handouts at meetings, signs on the wall, and so on. And other companies now have noticed, oh, the hardware to support this is available. They're starting now to develop this technology, and we have a jump on the market, and the users have the benefit of this technology several years earlier because of anticipating where the technology will be. And similarly, in creating our warfighting capability of the future, we need to anticipate where technology will be. It will be very different in each year as the typical technology development program, whether it's a venture-backed company or certainly the 5 or 10-year development cycle of technology for the Army. Technology is going to change a great deal, and we need to be building technology for the time period in which it will occur.
The system is in shooting mode. Camera is off. I'm ready. Camera is on. Field of view report. Top and right edges are visible. Taking picture.
So the field of view report is actually a pretty complex report that reports back to the user what it sees.
Processing picture.
Because a blind person may not know where the text is. You could just hold it up on a wall, it will say, well, you're cutting off the right edge of the sign.
Camera is 1 degree counterclockwise relative
so I hit that pretty well. It's only 1 degree off. But it can actually rotate any amount.
Page 1, GNR 289. The AI winter is long since over. We are well into the spring of narrow AI. Most of the examples above were research projects just 10 to 15 years ago. If all the AI systems in the world suddenly stopped functioning, our economic infrastructure would grind to a halt. Your bank would cease doing business. Most transportation would be crippled. Most communications would fail. This was not the case a decade ago. Of course, our AI systems are not smart enough yet to organize such a conspiracy. Strong AI. If you understand something in only one way, then you don't really understand it at all. This is because, if something goes wrong, you get stuck with a thought that just sits in your mind with nowhere to go. Speaking cancelled. Camera is off. An unsaved dot. Goodbye.
So let me take you through quickly through a couple dozen of these trends. We have, as I mentioned, hundreds of these. And you'll see actually how remarkably predictable many of these phenomena are, despite the vagaries of human history and the unpredictability of specific events, people, organizations, conflicts, and so on. I mentioned the paradigm shift rate. It's now doubling every decade. The telephone, which is really the first virtual reality technology, you could be with someone else despite being hundreds of miles apart, at least as far as talking was concerned. That had never happened before, the telephone. But that took half a century to be adopted by a quarter of the US population. These graphs are, for the most part, logarithmic graphs. As you go up the graph, each level represents a tenfold increase of whatever you're measuring over the level below it. So a straight line on a logarithmic graph is exponential growth. But half a century to be adopted by a mass audience, defined by a quarter of the population. Cell phone did that in 7 years. Telephone, radio, television, these early communication technologies took decades to be adopted by a mass audience. The PC, the cell phone, the web, the adoption times are measured in a few years. This acceleration has continued. 5 or 6 years ago, most people didn't use search engines. I mean, imagine life without search engines. That sounds like ancient history. That was 5 years ago. 3 years ago, the word blog, social network, podcast was not used. 3 years ago, people were saying you can't make money in internet advertising. You now have, one of the largest companies in the world worth $100 billion, or $150 billion at last count, gets 99% of its revenue from internet advertising. So the pace of change is accelerating. And this will affect every aspect of our lives and certainly our military engagements. And I have a whole theory as to why this is the case. I don't want to dwell on it, but basically an evolutionary process accelerates because it evolves a capability and then it incorporates that capability in its methods. And so the evolution of the next stage goes exponentially more quickly. So this is a double log graph. On the x-axis, it's how many years ago in powers of 10 this particular paradigm shift took place. On the y-axis, it's how long it took for that paradigm shift to be adopted until the next paradigm shift. So the first paradigm shift, the evolution of DNA, basically of biology itself, so that biological evolution had a little information backbone, a computer system to keep track of its experiments. That took about 1 billion years. Actually, RNA came first. But then evolution adopted DNA, RNA, and used it ever since. And so the Cambrian explosion, when all the body plans of the animals took place that took only 10 million years, about 100 times faster. And that then became a mature technology. There's been no evolution of body plans since the Cambrian explosion. So evolution concentrated on something else, higher cognitive functions. That only took a few million years. And then Homo sapiens, the first technology creating species, evolved in only a few 100,000 years. So there's been a continual acceleration. There's actually only 3 basically simple genetic changes that distinguish us from our primate ancestors. We have a larger skull at the expense of a weaker jaw, so don't get into a biting contest with another primate. More of the brain is devoted to the cerebral cortex, so we can do abstract reasoning. We can do what-if experiments in our mind. We can imagine, well, what if I took that stone and that stick and tied them together with that twine? I could actually extend my reach. And then we have an opposable appendage that actually works well, and we could actually carry out these experiments and create technology. A chimpanzee's hand looks similar, but the pivot point is down 1 inch. It's basically a bad design. They don't have a power grip. They don't have fine motor coordination. They can't really, you'll hear talk about primates using tools, but those tools don't evolve. The tools are pretty primitive. They don't go beyond a certain primitive stage. And so we created technology, and that has continued this evolutionary process. We always use the latest generation of technology to create the next generation. So half a century ago, the first computers, which you saw, like ENIAC, were literally designed pen on paper, wired with screwdrivers, and now we use computers. And 10th generation computer-assisted design software to do 12 layers of intermediate design, and you can design a new computer system in a matter of days. And this is a straight line on this double log graph showing this continual acceleration, showing technological evolution emerging smoothly from the biological evolution that created the technology-creating species in the first place. And if we look at this on a linear graph, it looks like everything has just happened. But some people looked at this and said, okay, well, Kurzweil only put points on this graph if they fit on the straight line. And if there was a paradigm shift that was off the straight line, I didn't bother to put it on there. So I took 14 different lists from 14 different thinkers. These were not people or organizations trying to either make or break my point. Carl Sagan's Cosmic Calendar, American Museum of Natural History, Encyclopedia Britannica, and about a dozen other lists, as to what they thought the key events in technological and biological evolution were. And there is some disagreement. Some people include the ARPANET with the internet, so it's 25 years, not 10 years, and some people feel the Cambrian explosion took 25 million years and not 10 million years. This disagreement when human language started, and so on. So you see some spreading of the points, but there's a very clear trend line, a very clear acceleration. Nobody thinks the internet took 1 million years. Nobody thinks the Cambrian explosion happened in 10 years. 1 billion years ago, not much happened in 1 million years. An evolutionary process accelerates. And we use evolutionary algorithms. I was chatting with Dr. Killian about that earlier. And we can experiment with the whole process of evolution by simulating in the computer, and we see the same phenomena of acceleration as an evolutionary process creates a capability and then utilizes that in subsequent stages. And I mentioned information technologies right now are doubling actually about every 11 months. It depends on what you measure. As we measure different aspects of technology, the doubling time might be 11, 12, 13 months, 15 months, but about once a year we double the price, performance, capacity, and bandwidth of information technology, which is really pretty phenomenal when you consider how much impact it has already. It's going to be about a billion-fold increase in the price performance of computing, as Dr. Killian alluded to, in the next 25 years. When I came to MIT, a computer that took about, I'd say, one of these sections, all the way to the back, it was IBM. It was MIT's computer, which we all shared, thousands of professors and students, an IBM 7094, quarter of a MIP, 144,000 bytes of memory. It's about 1,000 times less powerful than the computer in your cell phone today. But as I mentioned, Moore's Law is really just one example of many. Here I put 49 famous computers on this double log graph, going back over a century to the data processing equipment used in the 1890 census, then relay-based computers. Alan Turing cracked the German Enigma code. A lot of interesting wartime literature on how that was used and not used by Churchill and Roosevelt, because they had a complete transcription of all the Nazi messages. They couldn't use it without abandon, without tipping off the enemy that they'd cracked the code. So they would actually try to convince the enemy that they'd gotten the information some other way. If they knew a convoy of ships was coming, they'd send over a lone flyer. The German soldiers would say, German crew would say, we've been spotted, but actually that was just to convince them that that's how they got the information. But in the Battle of Britain, the information was used without reservation. So the Royal Air Force, despite being outgunned 3-1, was able to win that pivotal battle. 1950s, vacuum tubes were used. CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower, the first time the networks did that. Now, people say, well, Kurzweil just expects these exponential trends to go on forever, and we all know that exponential trends don't go on forever. They stop at some point. Rabbits in Australia multiply exponentially, then they eat up all the foliage, and that's the end of the exponential growth. And that's true. Every specific paradigm does run out of steam. But what happens in information technology is it leads to another paradigm. In fact, as we see the end of the line for a specific paradigm, it creates research pressure to create the next paradigm. And we've been through 5 paradigms in the 20th century. Moore's Law was not the first, but the 5th to bring exponential growth to computing. There were shrinking vacuum tubes in the 1950s, every year making them smaller and smaller and keeping this exponential growth of price performance of computing going. And finally that hit a wall. They couldn't shrink the vacuum tubes anymore and keep the vacuum. And that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the end of the exponential growth of computing. We then went to transistors, which are not small tubes. It's a whole different approach. And we've had several decades of Moore's Law, shrinking key features on an integrated circuit. And there's been regular predictions that that's going to come to an end. The first predictions were 2002. Intel says now 2022. Intel's roadmap and the semiconductor industry's so-called ITRS roadmap contemplates 4 nanometer features. We're now at 40 to 60, depending on the generation. But 4 nanometer features by around 2020. That's about 20 carbon atoms. And we'll get to a point then where we can't shrink them anymore and keep integrity of the circuits. And that will be the end of Moore's law. But Moore's law is the shrinking of features on a flat, two-dimensional integrated circuit. We'll then go to the sixth paradigm, which is computing in 3 dimensions. And we live in a 3-dimensional world. We might as well use the 3rd dimension. Our brain, which is organized in 3 dimensions, actually uses a very crude, slow, sluggish information processing method. It sends signals using chemical signals, which travel a few hundred feet per second. That's 1,000,000 times slower than electronics. The computations take place in the interneuronal connections, which compute about 200 calculations per second. That's about 1,000,000 times slower than today's computers. But it gets its power of being organized massively parallel in 3 dimensions. We have about 100 trillion interneuronal connections all computing simultaneously. And when I postulated that we would go into the 3rd dimension with self-organizing 3-dimensional molecular circuits in the book I wrote in 1999, The Age of Spiritual Machines, that was then a controversial notion. It is very much a mainstream notion today. There's been so much progress in the last 7 years that if you speak to the Intel scientists, they'll say, well, of course we will make the shift to 3-dimensional circuits in the teen years, well before we run out of speed or steam with the 2-dimensional circuits that underlie Moore's law. And we have them working already. In fact, there's a carbon nanotube memory due to come to the market next year. And you'll notice that this is not a straight line. This is a slow exponential. This is your exponential growth and the rate of exponential growth in the price performance of computing over the 20th century. But notice how smooth the progression that is. And this is the chart you saw earlier. Supercomputers marching along exponentially. Generally, my predictions, although people sometimes feel they're radically optimistic when I make them, turn out to be slightly conservative by design. This is a chart from a book that came out last year, The Singularity's Near. Predicts that supercomputers would hit 10 to the 16th, 10 million billion calculations per second by 2013. That's a significant threshold because that's the most conservative of the estimates of how much computation would require to simulate all several hundred regions of the human brain. I have 4 different analyses of that figure, and they come out between 10 to the 14th and 10 to the 16th. So I use the more conservative one. But 6 weeks after the book came to press, Japan announced 2 supercomputer projects to hit that figure in 2010, and IBM is now also predicting 2010 for 10 to the 16th calculations per second. And I don't want to dwell on these examples of electronics. You're familiar with them, but look at this chart here. This is the cost of a transistor. So when I was growing up in New York, I would hang out at the surplus electronics shops on Canal Street, which is still there, and buy something about this big, which was a telephone relay, and you saw an example of that I've got a secret clip from 1965. And a device about this big with a support circuitry, equivalent to 1 transistor, only a lot slower, cost about $40. So 1968, I was now an MIT student, you could buy a whole transistor a lot faster than my relay for just $1. In 2002, you could buy 10 million. Today, it's 100 million. Now, you've heard these fantastic comparisons of where we've come in electronics, and by the way, that also reflects where we will go. But what's another interesting aspect of this chart is look at how smooth this progression is. I mean, this looks like it's the output of some tabletop experiment, but this is actually the measure of the innovation, the competition of millions of people and thousands of companies in dozens of countries, with accusations of one country dumping products in another, and wars and recessions and IPOs and bankruptcies. And out of all this chaotic human activity comes this very smooth, very predictable progression in the price performance of electronics. And unlike Gertrude Stein's roses, it's not the case that a transistor is a transistor. As we've made them cheaper, they're actually better because they're smaller. The electrons have less distance to travel. So we've had smooth exponential growth in the speed of a transistor. So the cost of a transistor cycle has come down smoothly by half every 1.1 year. Now you add other forms of innovation like pipelining and data caching, and you get a doubling of price performance in electronics every year. And that turns out to be the case also as you look at things like databases, genetic data, brain scanning data. I mean, you could list 100 different manifestations of information technology, and you get a 40, 50, 60% deflation rate every year. And depending on what week it is, the economists will worry about inflation or deflation. And I think the Fed and Bernanke are back on inflation, but the economists will tell you that deflation's bad also. We had massive deflation during the Depression. And the concern of some economists is that, well, if you have this 50% deflation rate in information technology, and if, as is the case, the percentage of the economy comprised of information technology is growing as a percentage of the economy, and according to my projections, it will be most of the economy by the 2020s, then we'll have massive deflation when we get to the 2020s, and that's not a good thing. Because if you go a year later and you can get the same capability for half the money, you'll increase your consumption somewhat, but people aren't going to literally double their consumption each year, year after year, to keep up with this 50% deflation rate. So the size of the economy will shrink as measured in constant dollars, and for a variety of reasons, that's a bad thing. Well, that's not what we see. We actually more than double our consumption. We've had 18% growth in constant dollars for the last 50 years in every form of information technology, despite the fact that you can get twice as much information technology each year for the same amount of money. Because when price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications explode on the landscape. People didn't buy iPods for $10,000 15 years ago, which is what it would have cost. And National Institutes of Health wouldn't be talking about collecting 1 million genomes if it still cost $1 billion. But at $1,000, $1 billion to create this, really important database is a reasonable project. And there are many other examples. I just put magnetic data storage up because this is not Moore's law. People don't talk about a Moore's law for shrinking magnetic spots on a substrate. Different engineers, different companies, but we see the same progression. It's an inherent property of information. And when it comes to biology, this is a very important phenomena. This underlies our health and longevity. We are learning to actually reprogram biology. I mean, how much software do you have that you haven't changed in 30 weeks, let alone 30,000 years? And we have these 23,000 software programs, which is what they are, called genes, inside us that haven't changed much in thousands of years. And they evolved when conditions were very different. I mean, 1,000 years ago, the fat insulin receptor gene, which, as I mentioned, says hold on to every calorie, because the next hunting season may not work out so well, that was a good strategy. Because if you happen upon some calories, well, you probably didn't happen upon them. You probably worked hard to get them. You needed to store them. There were no refrigerators, so you stored them in your body. In fact, the fat insulin receptor gene is the innovation that allowed animals to roam around. Plants don't have a fat insulin receptor gene. But that now underlies an epidemic of obesity. And as I mentioned, when that was turned off in the fat cells, these animals remained very healthy, and they got the benefits of caloric restriction without the restriction. And there are a number of fat insulin receptor gene inhibitor drugs making their way through the testing and development pipeline. And we have a new technology that can turn genes off. Didn't exist. I mean, if RNA interference was first discovered 8 years ago. It really wasn't until 3 years ago that it was firmly demonstrated as a sign of acceleration. It only took a few years for that to be recognized with the Nobel Prize, which was announced just a few weeks ago. But that reliably allows us to turn genes off. And aside from the FIR gene, there are a lot of genes that underlie heart disease, cancer, and other major diseases that we would like to turn off. And there's over 1,000 drugs in development using RNA interference. And we can also use it, by the way, to turn off biological viruses, because viruses are genes. They're generally pathological genes. And it's been demonstrated you can turn biological viruses off with RNA interference. We can add new genes. I'm involved with one company where rather than sending the new gene through a viral vector, which then triggers the immune system, we take the cell out of the body, modify it in vitro, so it's no activation of the immune system, inspect that it got done correctly, the information's put in the right place, there are no other DNA errors, then we replicate it millions of times, which is a well-established technology, inject these now gene-modified lung cells back into the body. They go through the bloodstream. These are lung cells, so they don't end up in the heart or the liver, they end up in the lung. And this has actually cured a fatal disease, pulmonary hypertension, and it's now undergoing human trials. And that's just one of many examples of being able to either turn genes off, add new genes. We can reprogram biology at other levels, turning on and off enzymes, promoting and inhibiting proteins. Pfizer's torcetrapib, for example, turns off one specific enzyme at one stage of atherosclerosis. And the phase 2 trials showed that it was quite effective in most cases, halting atherosclerosis, which is very dramatic. And so Pfizer's spending a record $1 billion on the phase 3 trials. And that's just one example of many of this basic new paradigm of reprogramming biology, which is in really sharp contrast to how we used to do drug development, which is called drug discovery, just finding something. We automated that process to some extent, but we didn't design drugs to do very specific tasks, and it was basically hit or miss. And biology and medicine was not an information technology. It was just a grab bag of things we'd find. Oh, here's something that lowers blood pressure. We don't know why this works. There was no theory of operation. Now we can actually have a model of the information processes underlying a disease process like atherosclerosis and actually reprogram that process at key vulnerable points. And this is all escalating exponentially. It cost $10 per base pair in 1990. It's under a penny today. This slope on this log graph is a smooth doubling every year of the amount of genetic data we've sequenced, and the same thing is true of other aspects of biology. And we see the same thing in communications technology. I don't want to dwell on this, but I mean, here's that graph I had of the internet. I had just a little piece of this, the left-hand part of the graph in the mid-1980s, and saw the ARPANET doubling and predicted this worldwide communication network. But if you look at the same data on a linear scale, it looks like this. And this is how we experience the world. We experience technology in the linear domain. To the casual observer, it looked like the World Wide Web came out of nowhere. But you could see it coming if you looked at the inherently exponential trends. We're shrinking technology at an exponential rate. And we're now building systems at the molecular level. And one of the key aspects of biology that one of the key applications of this technology is in biology, to create small systems that are nano-engineered. And if it sounds very futuristic to put blood cell-sized devices in the bloodstream for therapeutic applications, I'd point out we are doing this already in animals. There are 4 major conferences on BioMEMS. One scientist actually cured type 1 diabetes with a blood cell-sized device, tens of thousands of them in the bloodstream of these animals, and it lets insulin out in a controlled fashion and blocks antibodies. At MIT, they have a blood cell-sized device that can detect specifically the antigens on the surface of cancer cells, latch onto the cell, burrow inside the cell, release toxins, and destroy the cancer cell, and then destroy itself. It's a pretty elaborate device, and that's today. We have devices you can put in the brain. They're not blood cell size yet. There's a pea-sized computer you can put in your brain if you have Parkinson's disease. That will actually replace the biological neurons destroyed by Parkinson's. And the latest generation of this device allows you to actually download new software to your neural implant from outside the patient. And this device now interacts with the biological neurons that used to get signals from this region of the brain before it was destroyed by that disease. And this hybrid of biological and non-biological intelligence works just fine. So these are applications that are happening today. If you apply this billion-fold increase of power of information technology and 100,000-fold decrease in the size of key features over the next quarter century, these blood cell-sized devices will be quite sophisticated as we go into the 2020s. This is a design of a robotic red blood cell, which is actually a pretty simple system. We actually we have reverse-engineered red blood cells. They store oxygen and release them in a controlled fashion using a fairly straightforward algorithm. And a conservative analysis of this Resprosite indicates if you replace 10% of your red blood cells with this robotic version, you could do an Olympic sprint for 15 minutes without taking a breath, or sit at the bottom of your pool for 4 hours. So, honey, I'm in the pool will take on a whole new significance. But these are actually quite feasible applications, and there are impressive things being done in animal experiments already. If we come back to our exponential growth of computing, we'll see that we'll have plenty of computation to simulate the human brain as we get to the 2020s. But then the key issue is, will we have the software? Or will these just be very fast calculators? And ultimately, although we will learn a lot from just doing AI experiments, as we have for 30 years, we'll actually learn the secrets of human intelligence from human intelligence itself. And it's not hidden from us. The spatial resolution of brain scanning is doubling every year in 3D volume. The amount of data we're gathering on the brain is doubling every year. But then the question comes up, okay, we're getting this data now. For the first time, we can actually see the individual interneuronal connections and see them firing in real time. which wasn't feasible before. I mean, you've all seen fMRI images, which are kind of cool. You see somebody solving a logic puzzle and this region of their brain lights up, but that's not high enough resolution to actually reverse engineer what's going on. You really need to see the individual interneuronal connections. Well, I described one new technology from the University of Pennsylvania that allows us to do that in a living brain, and there's half a dozen other technologies like that. And we're getting this data for the first time. We can see the brain create our thoughts. We can actually see our thoughts create our brain because we do have this feedback loop. As we think about a subject, we create new interneuronal connections and readjust neurotransmitter concentrations to reflect that knowledge. But can we make heads or tails of this data? Are we smart enough to understand our own intelligence? Doug Hofstadter has said for many years, well, maybe our intelligence is just below that threshold necessary to understand our intelligence. And if we were smarter and able to understand our brains, well, then necessarily our brain would be that much more complicated and we'd never catch up with it. And maybe there's a math theorem in there that a complex system can't be so complex as to understand its own complexity. It turns out that's not what we're finding. We're finding as we get the data for specific regions, we can characterize the transformations that that region is making to information and how it transforms it, how it sends that information to other regions. This is a block diagram of a dozen regions of the auditory cortex that have been modeled and simulated, and we can then apply sophisticated psychoacoustic tests to the simulation. We get very similar results as applying those same tests to human auditory perception. Doesn't prove the model is perfect, but it's actually pretty impressive. We have a simulation of the cerebellum, which comprises more than half the neurons in the brain, where we do our skill formation. And again, applying sophisticated skill formation tests to the simulation gets similar results as applying those same tests to human skill formation. And it brings up another important question, which is, how complicated is the human brain? Well, if I take the cerebellum, if I show you the cerebellum and I say, here, reverse engineer this, and you look at it and you see these trillions, literally, of convoluted, complex interconnections that are constantly varying. Each connection looks very complicated, and there's trillions of them. You'd say, well, this is beyond us. We'll never be able to figure this out. Well, we have figured it out. We actually understand the wiring of the cerebellum. There's only a few genes responsible for it, comprising only a few tens of thousands of bytes of information. Basically, the genome says the following about the cerebellum. It says there's 4 different types of neuron. One module is organized kind of like this. Now repeat 10 billion times and add some random variation within each repetition. And that's basically a summary of what the genome says. And then this largely stochastically wired cerebellum interacts with the environment, and the child learns to walk and to talk and to catch a fly ball, and it gets filled up with meaningful information because it's a self-organizing system. But the actual design is about 1 billion times simpler than the apparent manifestation. And if you look at this image, I mean, this looks very complex. In fact, it's on the cover of a book called Complexity. It's the Mandelbrot set. You've probably seen it. And it looks very complicated. And as we zoom in on it, we see complexity within complexity. But the design of this very complex image is 6 letters long. That's the formula for the Mandelbrot set. It's 6 characters long, applied iteratively. It's a fractal. And actually, the genome is a fractal. It's a probabilistic fractal, and that actually describes its relationship to the brain very well. There's only 30 to 50 million bytes of design information in the brain. How do we know that? Well, the design of the brain is in the genome, the body also. And the genome doesn't have that much information in it. There's 3 billion rungs, that's 6 billion bits, which is 800 million bytes. But it's replete with redundancies. One sequence called ALU, which is a lengthy sequence, is repeated 300,000 times. So those of you familiar with data compression know that if you have a lot of repetition, you can apply lossless compression and greatly compress that information. I show in the book how applying lossless compression of the genome, you can reduce it to 30 to 50 million bytes. My point is not that that's simple, but it's a level of complexity that we can manage, and we are showing that we can reverse engineer the brain. And I make the case that within 20 years, we really will have models and simulations of all several hundred regions. And that will provide us with the paradigms for creating intelligent systems that will greatly expand our AI toolkit. And all of this is driving economic gains. I don't want to dwell on this, but we've gone from $30 to $130 in constant dollars, the value of an average hour of human labor in 45 years. E-commerce, the adoption of these technologies is a smooth exponential. Now you might say, now wait a second, wasn't there a boom and a bust in this dot-com phenomena during this time period? Well, that was just a capital markets phenomena. Wall Street looked at the internet and said, wow, this is going to change everything. This is going to turn every business model on its head. That was accurate. But it wasn't going to do that instantaneously. If you remember my internet graph, on a linear graph, which is how we experience technology, it was growing exponentially, but it looked like nothing was happening when you're doubling these little numbers. It took 10 years till it took off. So Wall Street came back 3 years later, around 1999, 2000, and said, gee, it hasn't changed every business model. I guess we were wrong, and all the values went the other way. But meanwhile, it was actually growing exponentially. Now it's achieving some significant numbers. There's $1 trillion of e-commerce, so we're doubling significant numbers. So we've had smooth exponential growth, but this actual boom-bust psychology is actually an accurate harbinger of true revolutions. It happened in telecommunications, it happened in artificial intelligence, and it even happened with the railroads in the 19th century. So let me show you one last technology and then make a few concluding comments about what we'll see early in the next decade and then the decade after that. This is another technology we put together. It builds on some of Dr. Killian's slides, but in one of my companies we created the first large vocabulary speech recognition. So we took the current version of that technology from Nuance, which used to be Kurzweil Computer Products. In another one of my companies in the 70s, we created the first text-to-speech synthesis. I put that in the first reading machine for the blind. We took a contemporary version of that with contemporary language translation and created a translating telephone. And I've used this to talk to people around the world. Talked to this woman in Germany. I talked English. She heard me in German and vice versa. And we were able to converse just fine. And this will be a routine service of your cell phone early in the next decade. This is a demonstration, comma.
Dies ist eine Demonstration
Of a prototype of a quote translating end quote telephone. Period.
von einem Prototyp eines übersetzenden Telefons.
Within a few years, comma,
Innerhalb einiger Jahre
we will be able to talk to anyone, comma,
wir werden fähig sein, zu jemandem zu reden,
regardless of their language. Period.
ohne Rücksicht auf ihre Sprache.
The rain in Spain, comma,
La pluie en Espagne
stays mainly in the plain. Period.
reste dans la plaine principalement.
Merci pour votre attention. Period.
Thank you for your attention.
So that is synthetic speech. A lot of the AI work has actually been devoted to getting a normal inflection so that it sounds natural. So early in the next decade, computers are going to start to disappear. Some people feel that's already happening. They lose their nano iPods in their pocket. I have my whole photo and movie collection on a 4 gigabyte flash drive, which is literally the size of a fingernail, and I have lost it. But computers will be really everywhere. We'll have computing and communications everywhere. We'll have self-organizing nodes of communication, this worldwide mesh concept, which was actually pioneered by the Army, so that you can place a battalion in place. The communications all self-organizes. There's no centralized hub. If portions of it go down, the information routes around it. Intel and Microsoft have now adopted the worldwide mesh concept. So if your cell phone today and your PC are not nodes on the internet, they're spokes into the internet, and then there's self-organization inside the internet. But all of our devices will be nodes on this worldwide mesh, but not only sending and receiving your own communications, but sending and receiving other people's communications, and it'll be continually self-organizing. It'll be very robust. These devices will be tiny. They'll be everywhere in the environment. They'll be embedded in our clothing. In terms of display technology, which Dr. Killian talked about, one good solution is to put the displays in your eyeglasses, beam them directly to your retina, and I know the Army already utilizes this technology. Surgeons also use it to be in a virtual reality technology. virtual reality environment. So it can create images on your retina. You can have a virtual screen hovering in there that's high resolution, or it can encompass your whole visual field of view to put you in a virtual reality environment, or have augmented real reality. Early in the next decade, you'll be able to look at someone and there'll be face recognition and it'll recognize who that person is, and there'll be little pop-ups in your visual field of view reminding you who that person is, reminding you what their name is. That would be very helpful. We'll have effective language translation. We'll be interacting with virtual personalities. If we go to the end of the 2020s, we'll have about 30 doublings in the next 25 years of information technology in terms of price performance and capacity. That's, as I mentioned, a factor of 1 billion increase. We will have reverse engineered the human brain. We'll have greatly expanded the AI toolkit. Non-biological intelligence will then combine the basically pattern recognition powers of biological intelligence, which are improving, but humans still have an edge in that area. That's really where we excel, with ways in which computers are already superior. I mean, a computer like this can remember billions of things accurately. We're hard-pressed to remember a handful of phone numbers. So it'll be a very powerful combination, but it's not an alien invasion of intelligent machines to compete with us. This is really an expansion of our human civilization. It's already the case. Very few professionals today could do any work at all without their computers, and certainly science, even mathematics, cannot be done without computers. We're already expanding our intelligence as a species and as a civilization through our computer tools. As the tools get closer to us, as they enter our clothing, ultimately our bodies and brains will be directly expanding our powers of intelligence and knowledge, and keep up with this doubling of the knowledge base. We're the only species that has knowledge altogether, and the size of that knowledge base is growing exponentially. And finally, all this will impact our longevity. It was not in the interests of the species for people to live past child rearing 1,000 years ago, because resources were precious, and so once you were done raising your children, it was not in the interest of the species for lots of people like that to continue living. So human life expectancy post-infant mortality was about 25 1,000 years ago. It was 37 in 1800. Schubert and Mozart died in the 30s, and that was typical. There was no sanitation. The people didn't understand what a bacterial infection was. There was no antibiotics. And life was short and difficult, disease-filled, disaster-prone, as Thomas Hobbes described it a few hundred years ago. It was 48 in 1900. When Social Security was put in place in the 1930s, 65 was considered old, and we have a different perspective on that today. But when we get to the full blossoming of the biotechnology revolution, 10 or 15 years from now, these biological technologies will be thousands of times more capable than they are today. According to my models, we'll be adding more than a year every year to your remaining life expectancy, not infant life expectancy. So as you go forward a year, your own life expectancy will move on away from you. So if you can hang in there for another 15 years, we may get to experience the remarkable century ahead. Thank you very much.